you, Biswajit. Not only did you keep to time, but you really remained focused. And I think we have in front of us a very good resume and a summary of where South Asia is in terms of its human potential. So let's move right on to my distinguished panel. The rules are that each of them has 5 minutes. That hopefully leaves us enough time to really engage with you, because we haven't had that engagement since the morning. And I think at least I was getting anxious that we were not giving a chance. So I hope that we'll leave aside enough time if everybody here stays to their time. I'm first going to call on Martin Rama, who, as many of you know, is the chief economist of the South Asia region for the World Bank. But more importantly, he's also the director of the 2013 World Development Report on Jobs. And by moving to South Asia, he is following an august tradition that the WDR that I worked on in 2004 set, when after finishing the WDR, almost the entire team was imported into the South Asia region of the World Bank. And I myself worked in Delhi for a number of years as part of that group. Martin, I hope, will lay some of the broad insights developed from the WDR and now in his current job at the bank handling the South Asia region. Martin?
Thank you, Shekhar. Is this working?
Yeah.
No. Thank you for that introduction. For those of you interested, there are, I think, copies outside of the overview of the World Development Report on Jobs. And I would like to use that perhaps as an introduction to be a bit controversial in relation to the discussion on this panel. And the title of this session is Harnessing Human Capital Potential. And as economists, when we think about human capital potential, immediately we think skills, education, vocational education and training, and so on and so forth. And of course, all that is extremely important, don't get me wrong. But the point I want to make is that to harness the human capital potential of South Asia, jobs are extremely important. When we were writing this report, we decided at the end of every chapter to finish with what we called a difficult question, which was a way of saying, okay, in which way the framework we are using makes us challenge some of our conventional wisdom. And one of those difficult questions, number 5, in fact, was skills or jobs, which comes first? And I want to argue that in a case of low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, jobs are fundamental. That motivation for that question came from several conversations we had about the experience of East Asia. One of them was with Justin Lin, who was then our chief economist for the bank, a position that now Kaushik Basu holds. Justin had been very much involved in China's reforms. And one of the points he made to us from the beginning was, skills before Deng Xiaoping and after Deng Xiaoping were roughly the same. That's not what changed the landscape of China. Another conversation that took us in that direction was one with Paul Romer, an eminent scholar on growth issues. He said, what the best skills policy East Asia had was to put people to work productively. And I want to build on that in several ways. One, this ticking bomb to which Shekhar was referring, these young cohorts entering the labor force at a pace of something like 1.1 million a month for the next 20 years in South Asia. Most of them are already either out of school or on a path that will not take them too far into school. We cannot anticipate that all of a sudden they will make a detour and end up in universities, first thing. Second thing, we have reviewed very carefully the experience with vocational education and training, and it's not very compelling. You can do things, but you cannot make miracles with vocational education and training. Some countries got it right. Germany got it right, but their model is extremely difficult to export for many reasons. Third point, when we look at earnings functions, something that labor economists do a lot, we notice that a year of work is worth as much as a third or a half of a year of formal education. So if you cannot get your skills in school, you can get your skills somewhere else. And then last but not least, I think there is good evidence by now that jobs pool skills. There is a very nice study for Bangladesh on the garment industry, where it traces what happens in villages as factories, garment factories open up in the proximity of the village, within commuting distance of the village. Within the next 5 years, in those villages, and we have control groups and all that, families put their kids, and especially the girls, much more to school. Why? Because there is this opportunity. So when the opportunity of productive jobs is there, investments and decisions by households also go in the direction of skills. Now, for this point that Paul Romer made, that the best policy you can have for skills is to put people to work, you need to put people to work into productive jobs. And the second point I want to make is that one of the worrying things about South Asia is how many of the jobs are of very low productivity. We can be enamored of the services sector and think about the Unisys and all the IT industry, but the reality is that the services sector is to a large extent made of street vendors and activities like that, where it's not very credible that a lot of learning, a lot of productivity gains will come from there. That affects, in a way, the way we think. That lack of attention to who are in the informal sector affects the way we think about policies for this sector. One of the things we found in doing this report was how little we know about informal sector firms. We have a good idea about households and people, where people work, and so we can say, oh yeah, sure, 90% of people in South Asia work in the informal sector. But when it comes to firms, our surveys tend to focus on formal sector firms. And so we have a very distorted picture, even for middle-income countries, of what are the firms that we have in an economy, and what makes for productive firms beyond that small group that is formal. If we had to answer even a simple question like, who creates jobs, we will have trouble. All of us will say, oh, it's small and medium enterprises. No. When we look at countries, low-income and middle-income countries, we reconstructed carefully for Ethiopia, for Indonesia, we did even for Chile. Micro-enterprises are the main creator of jobs. The problem is that micro-enterprises are also the main destroyer of jobs. There's a lot of churning, and there is very little productivity. So my time is coming to an end. I want just to leave it with a kind of more follow-up thought, which is what to do then to increase productivity when the hope is not just to expand the formal sector, but when you have 90% of the people working in informal sector activities, what does it take to make those jobs too more productive?
Thank you, Martin. I think it's a wise caution. Skills or jobs first. So I think that's set the table for us. I'm now going to turn to Mahendra Lama to talk about his view on how education plays a role in this. Mahendra, as I'm sure most of you know, is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Indira Gandhi National Open University in Delhi. Mahendra.
Well, thank you.
It's on.
Well, thank you very much. Well, since India is going to play a key role in reaping this demographic dividend paradigm, let me emphasize on what is happening in India. Today also 82% of the 18 to 23 age groups, they do not have access to higher education. And today also, the gross enrollment ratio is hardly 19%, and we are striving to make it 30% by around 2025. And today also, the density of the higher education institutions is one of the lowest in the world. We have two very significant gaps in the country today. One is, of course, the quality gap, and the second is the quantity gap. And you find huge variations in quality of educations between the state universities, within the state, between the state and the central universities, and within the central universities, and of course between the private universities and the public universities. And you have a huge quantity gap. You can see that whenever universities, central universities advertise for teaching positions, you hardly get teachers in the country today. About 20 plus new universities, central universities have been set up, and it has been such a Herculean task to get teachers, the quality teachers. Applicants for one post will be 300, 400, but you don't get 3 good teachers to teach in the university system. The other aspect has been the quality of the teachers itself. When Government of India declared that under the Right to Education Act, all the school teachers will have to be trained by 2015 March, right? Compulsorily trained. Then you will see huge numbers of teachers who remain untrained for 25, 30 years would suddenly come out to the market and say, we would like to be trained because now their jobs are in danger. So against this backdrop, what do we do? And I see similar kind of trend in whole of South Asia, right? If you go to Nepal, Pakistan, Bhutan, you get more or less similar kind of trends. And unless you really refocus, reorient, and repositions your education policies in different countries at different levels for different communities, it's very, very difficult to really make them oriented to the jobs. Really, and it would be increasingly difficult for us to think about how to really reap these benefits of demographic dividend. So the question today is the reforms. It's all about reforms. How do we undertake reforms in the education sector, particularly in the higher education sector, right? And when you do reforms, when you talk about reforms, the first thing is quality. The quality part of it, how do you benchmark and ensure minimum standards in the education systems? The second is we really need to talk about the entire education policies. Many states in India do not have education policy as such. You have a national education policy, but you don't have a state education policy. And education is essentially in the state list, right? So you have such kind of situations. And the crucial questions for all of us in South Asia is you have strong so-called regulatory bodies in the higher educations. You have the university grants commissions, you have the National Council for Technical Educations, you have the Council for all kinds of, you have the regulatory bodies. I have never seen the regulatory bodies coming together to discuss about some kind of a quality and some kind of a pattern in the university system. So I think it's high time that we should really talk about a kind of a slightly larger framework of region, right? And in what way the higher education should be brought under some kind of a regional framework, and in what way we can, the regulatory institutions or bodies could come together and really rethink our position as far as what you call the human capital, development of human capital is concerned. My last important issue would be the challenge today is really how to integrate school education with the higher education. Right? It's a very, very critical challenge to all of us in South Asia. And this time, at least, the 12th plan of Government of India discusses in depth about why there is a need to integrate the school educations with the university system. And I think that leads us to absolutely a different kind of debate and discourse on higher education and building human capital in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahendra. Thank you again for another very important set of concerns about quality, about the transition from K to 12 to actual jobs that matter for the economy and that matter for the worker herself or himself. I think these are important concerns that we want to come back to. I'm next going to turn to Riffat Ayesha Anis from Pakistan, who, as all of you know, is the director for the SAES Human Resource Development Center in Islamabad. Given her institutional focus, I think it'd be very useful to hear from her how she and her colleagues think about the challenges that South Asia and in particular Pakistan itself faces in this respect. Is the microphone working?
Yes, it's on. Thank you, sir. I would like to say a few words about my center. SAES Human Resource Development Center was established in Pakistan, Islamabad in the year 1998 with the aim to promote knowledge, inputs, and technical and behavioral skills in the SAARC region. And it has the objective to develop capacity of government functionaries, policy makers, trainers, and development practitioners. Talking on today's theme on the human development, we know that it has more importance in the labor surplus countries with high labor and low capital resources. And it can be achieved through the capacity building of the individuals, organizations, states, or societies. And human capital management is talking about three capacities: capacity to develop talent, capacity to deploy talent, and capacity to draw talent. And as my earlier colleague, my speaker, has already said that about 3 million people, if I'm not wrong, they are working out of South Asia, and the developed countries are doing this brain draining to our region. Collectively, these three capacities form the backbone of any country's human capital competitiveness. The challenges are numerous and have been highlighted by the early speakers in the morning as well, and today's session as well. The way in which my center can contribute in capacity building of this South Asian region is through conducting workshops, training programs, and research on different aspects which are demand-driven and which are focusing on the SAARC development goals and Millennium Development Goals. If we talk about education, they have just said that we need good reforms and good quality education. This has already been discussed. As we know that healthy body keeps healthy mind, there is need to spend more percentage of GDP in the field of education and health for individuals to be more productive. In the morning session, two speakers in their speeches, they have emphasized on the need to conduct research. In this context, I would like to highlight that my center has been conducting research on the human capital, and I invite all of you to visit our website where the recent studies have been uploaded, and we have conducted research on microfinance, global financial crisis, trade, remittances, and all these researches have been linked with the human resource development as well. And I don't want to take much of the time. I think this is enough, and we want to, our center want to focus. And in this context, I would like to say that we need more collaboration and more support among the member states so that we can fulfill our programs and undertake this activity in a more positive way. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Nishi. I think you're exactly right that this is going to be a common problem. It isn't going to be a problem just of one state or one region or one country. I think we are going to all be confronted by the ticking time bomb that I mentioned. There is a particular concern about female labor participation and the education of girl child, children, women, and I hope we can bring that into bear as well. Because when you compare India and China, China's female participation rate was substantially higher when it was going through its demographic dividend. We seriously have to think about what that means for South Asia as a region. I'm now going to turn to Rafiq Dossani to give his views. Rafiq is senior economist at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica in California. And he has in the past been also the director of the Stanford Center for South Asia. Rafiq?
Thank you, Shekhar. So to give a sense of the crisis that's in a sense is implicit in what's being discussed, although India and many of the other countries are still going through a population bulge, if you look at those who are in the educable age group, actually that peak is happening now. And so if the problem of education and skills development is not tackled in the next few years, it'll actually be too late. So to give you an example, if you look at those in the 20 to 24 age group for India, currently they make up 8.8% of the population. That's going to, by 2020, be 8.7. And by 20, it'll be down to 6.4. In other words, already the educable group has peaked or is peaking, and therefore something has to be done now. So in that context, if you look at what needs to be done, I'm going to take Bishwajit's point about focusing too little on tertiary versus primary and secondary. My view is that this is a problem that cuts across the educational spectrum. Again, if you look at, what's happening is that jobs, as Martin points out, is driving what people study at tertiary level. But before that, they have to be ready for the tertiary level of education. If you look at Indian data, everyone, at least from India, would be familiar with the Pratham survey, where you're seeing that, which, they do about 7 lakh children survey every year in rural areas. What they found that only 30% in their latest survey, only 30% of children in standard 3 in a government school and 55% in a private school can read at standard 1 levels or better. In addition, the problem is becoming worse with time. So 2012 numbers are worse than 2011, and so that trend continues. Some of that undoubtedly is due to a larger population entering that space, but not all of it. So in that context, I want to raise the issue of private education. Clearly the performance in private K-12 is better. But I think the real problem is, and I'd like to use today's newspaper headline, no, no, and no to privatization. Okay, I think at the school level, whether it be early childhood education, which has been proven again and again in repeated contexts to be the biggest way of removing the divide among income groups, or if you look at K-12 or at tertiary, the government is not fulfilling its role. Okay, it needs to spend more at all levels. And this is particularly true at the tertiary level. So, if you look at areas like engineering education, what you see is today in India, 98% of provision in terms of students enrolled is provided by the private sector. And the quality is abysmal. Okay, now some of that is system related, which has to do with the quality of teachers, with infrastructure and so on. But a lot of that is due to not enough spending by the state. So if you compare, for example, Tsinghua University, which is a premium university in China, how much they spend per student on engineering, it's $51,000 a year. The highest that's spent in India is in the IITs, which is $8,000 a year. You're not going to get the quality if you don't make that commitment to spending. The private sector is not going to do it. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point relates to the workforce issues, which is that, and it sort of echoes what Martin was saying, is that we really need to look closely at the services sector and say, why do we want the countries of South Asia to become service-driven economies? When they aren't generating enough employment and in taking an increasing share of GDP, is that a good thing? I would argue not. It suggests, although more work needs to be done, that what's driving services growth is consumer services and not business services. If you look at Western economies, for example, all the jobs growth comes from business service growth. Perhaps not so in South Asia. I think we need to do much more work on how important manufacturing is, which will then spin off business services, which can then become engines of growth. And you're not going to have growth if you look just at services as driving growth, irrespective of what is happening in manufacturing. And finally, the issue I'd like to raise is of the diaspora, which Bishwajit raised, about how its networks and knowledge spillovers can help the domestic economy. The reality is quite different. So let me take a controversial point of view by pointing out that in the IT-enabled services sector, whether you look at the TCS sort of companies or the WNS sort of companies that do business process outsourcing, almost nothing has been contributed by the diaspora, whether it's in terms of starting companies or the employment they develop. Nothing has been contributed. And I'm not blaming the diaspora. They don't find the skills available within India and I presume the rest of South Asia to drive this sort of growth. So I would question to what extent the government's policy strategy should be based around what the diaspora can contribute until this K-12 focus is properly looked after. Thanks.
Thank you, Rafiq. Another set of important questions about how much we are spending. Are we spending too little? Are we spending too little for what we are getting for what we are spending? and who's going to do the spending, the private sector or governments. So I think we are throwing up a whole range of issues that I hope we can engage with all of you when we finish our round of contributions. I'm now going to turn to Rameshore Khanal, who is professor at the South Asian Institute of Management in Nepal. Rameshore?